Hello there, this is Air and Space History, a channel about the history of air and space. Today's video will be a brief history of aviation, but stay tuned for next week's video, which will be a brief history of rocketry and the space race. So, in 1903, the Wright brothers achieved the world's first manned winged flight under engine power, which lasted only 12 seconds and made it 120 feet or 36 meters downrange. Then, in 1967, only 64 years after Orville Wright barely lifted off the ground in his flying machine made of wood and fabric, the X-15 rocket plane set an aircraft speed record of 4,519 miles per hour or 7,274 kilometers per hour that still stands to this day. We're going to track the history of flight and understand exactly how we defied nature to make pigs, or their close genetic relatives known as humans, fly. So, before we can fly, we need to float. I probably won't be touching too much on air balloons and zeppelins on this channel, but I think it's at least worth mentioning a few of these milestones. These craft fall into the category of lighter-than-air vehicles, which means that they use buoyant forces to fly, just like those party balloons filled with helium at that cousin's birthday party you were forced to go to in the 3rd grade. Anyways, in 1783, the first hot air balloon was created by the Montgolfier brothers in France, which started the era of airborne humans. The first powered flight was in 1852, when Henry Giffard of France flew his steam-powered airship. However, the vehicle still relied on being lighter than air to stay afloat, and only used power to make modest course corrections. There were some instances of, ooh, you almost had it when trying to achieve heavier-than-air flight, like when John Stringfellow of Chard, England, created a winged vehicle as early as 1848, but unfortunately, it was not manned. Also, in 1890, Clement Ader created an odd bat-looking vehicle that managed to fly around 160 feet, and while he did lift off the ground, the flight was uncontrolled and his further attempts were unsuccessful. And that, my friends, brings us to 1903, where the Wright brothers, who, after years of building upon their predecessors' work and testing unpowered gliders, finally were able to lift off the ground in a controlled, heavier-than-air powered flight. This image was captured showing the historic moment of the Flyer 1 or 1903 Flyer lifting off the ground. The Wright brothers were able to obtain repeatable flight from this vehicle, the first test taking Orville Wright a mere 120 feet downrange, less than the wingspan of the average modern commercial airliner, while the last test of 4 took Wilbur a much more impressive but still modest 852 feet downrange. The Wright brothers went on to develop the Flyer 2 in 1904 and the Flyer 3 in 1905, continually building on their design to increase performance, stability, and controllability, but generally keeping the same biplane design of wood and fabric. The Flyer 3 was able to make an impressive 24.2 mile or 39 kilometer circling flight at an altitude of about 50 feet or 15 meters. Finally, in 1905, someone thought, hey, it'd probably be a good idea to write some of these achievements down. So the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, or FAI, was founded and began keeping formalized aircraft records. Therefore, the Flyer 3 is the first airplane in the record books. Continuing on, in 1908, the Blériot 8, designed by a guy named, big shocker here, Louis Blériot, was the first plane to use a modern control system that is still used today. A stick to control the pitch and roll of the aircraft, and rudder foot pedals to control the yaw. 1908 was also unfortunately the year of the first aviation death, when Thomas Selfridge of the U.S. Army died in a crash of the Wright Flyer, piloted by Orville Wright. 1909 saw the first official pilot's license being given to the same Louis Blériot, and about 1 year later the first woman was given her pilot's license, named Raymond de la Roche. Anyways, as the world began to realize the efficacy and potential use of these newfangled flying machines, large leaps of aviation innovation continued both for civil use and for military applications. The next several decades saw steady improvements to mainly biplane and triplane vehicles, that is, planes having 2 or 3 wings stacked on top of each other. That being said, while biplanes did dominate, some development went into monoplanes on a smaller basis. For example, the Blériot 8 that we already mentioned was a monoplane, and in 1909 the Blériot 11 monoplane was the first plane ever to fly across the English Channel. The design of the Blériot 11 was remarkably advanced and made it a record-setting aircraft. Restored versions of it even still fly today. The first ever recorded dogfight, which is a close-range fight between two aircraft, occurred in 1913. The circumstances of the first dogfight were actually a bit silly, and it was more of a mock fight for show. It was between two American mercenaries that had been hired to opposite sides in a conflict in Mexico. Both pilots were flying a Curtiss D biplane and fired pistols at one another, albeit neither pilot actually intended to hit the other. A year later, in 1914, Europe was engulfed in the First World War, which saw the first truly effective use of airplanes in a military setting, and of course, humans being humans, aircraft developed greatly quickened when it became a weapon of war. At first, aircraft were mainly used for reconnaissance of enemy lines and occasionally dropping of a bomb by hand. However, as the war progressed, bombers could carry heavier loads, and each side sought to maintain air superiority over the other through the deployment of fighter aircraft. This led to a myriad of dogfights in the skies above Europe, and also the adoption of the term ace, a pilot who has 5 or more air victories. The most famous ace of the First World War was German Manfred von Richthofen, known more commonly as the Red Baron, who had over 80 air victories. I'm certainly going to do tons of videos on the notable planes, battles, and tactics of both world wars, so I don't want to linger here for too long. The period following the Great War saw still steady improvements in all categories of flight, including speed, takeoff weight, ceiling, and range. The first transatlantic flight was completed by John Alcock and Arthur Brown in a modified British Vickers Vimy bomber. Try to say that 5 times fast. In 1919, when they flew from Canada to Ireland and were met on the ground by none other than Sir Winston Churchill to present them their prize. 8 years later, in 1927, Charles Lindbergh would be the first to fly solo non-stop from New York to Paris in his famous plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. And 5 years later, Amelia Earhart would become the second person to fly solo non-stop across the Atlantic. As the years passed, engineers realized both the speed and efficiency of monoplanes could greatly outmatch biplanes or triplanes, and materials and structures had developed such that a single wing was viable to build. Therefore, the monoplane began to dominate the record books. The Schneider Trophy race that took place in the late 20s and the early 30s particularly inspired Aviation, which was a seaplane race that had plane manufacturers competing for the title of maximum speed. In 1931, the Supermarine S-6B set the world speed record of 655 kilometers per hour, or 407 miles per hour, and was the predecessor to the famous Spitfire designed by R.J. Mitchell. The low-wing monoplane design was widely adopted across all militaries in the world, and the new efficacy of aircraft in combat was proven to a lesser extent by the German Luftwaffe in the mid-1930s as they participated in the Spanish Civil War, and to a much greater extent during the German invasion of all surrounding countries in Europe in the following years. The Third Reich started the deadliest conflict in human history, the Second World War, with the invasion of Poland in September 1939, and used an unprecedented tactic of swift thrusts of armored vehicles, backed up by constant attacks from dive bombers and fighter aircraft to decimate an enemy's defenses. This tactic was then used with the same deadly efficacy in May of the next year against France and the Low Countries, leaving Britain alone against the German Fortress Europe. This led to what is now probably the most famous air battle in history, the Battle of Britain, in which British Hawker Hurricanes and Supermarine Spitfires fought nearly to the brink of destruction to repel the German Luftwaffe's attacks and bombing raids on the island nation. As the war progressed, Germany attacked Russia in mid-1941 and Japan attacked the United States in late 1941, catalyzing the involvement of two massive nations with colossal industrial output and populations, which effectively spelt doom for both Germany and Japan. While aircraft did not play a pivotal role in the Eastern Front of the European theater between Russia and Germany, it was at the forefront of both the Pacific theater and the Western Front in Europe. On the Western Front, Britain and the United States bombed German-controlled Europe both by day and night in the new heavy bomber class of aircraft, and after D-Day and the Allied invasion of Fortress Europe, aircraft still played an important role in supporting ground troops and even deploying airborne infantry known as paratroopers. In the Pacific, aircraft, and by extension aircraft carriers, became the key tool in all naval battles to come. Many naval battles were fought without the enemy ships even seeing one another, as was the case in the Battle of Midway when carrier-borne SBD Dauntless dive bombers destroyed 4 Japanese carriers, crippling the Japanese fleet and placing it on the defensive for the remainder of the war. The most technologically advanced Allied projects of the war were also, unfortunately, the most devastating and controversial. These projects being the B-29 Superfortress and the Manhattan Project, also known as the atomic bomb. In 1945, B-29 bombers dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan in the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the Second World War. 2 other technologies came from the war that would forever change the course of aviation, emerging primarily from Germany. As traditional fighting and warfare began to fail, the Germans increasingly looked towards wonder weapons and technologies that, while extremely advanced and ahead of their time, simply did not have enough development time to be effectively deployed. No, we're not talking about ray guns from Call of Duty. These technologies were, of course, the V-1 and V-2 rockets, as well as the invention of the first jet aircraft. We're going to be talking about the V-2 rocket more in the next video on spaceflight and rocketry, so for now I won't expound further there. The first rocket-powered airplane, the German Henkel HE-176, successfully flew but did not gain much traction. The Messerschmitt Me-163 was the first widely produced rocket plane used in the war at a total of around 370 units, so still not much, but it was eventually overshadowed by the Me-262, which was an air-breathing jet-powered aircraft and used far less fuel than rocket planes. Germany produced 1,430 Me-262s, which does seem like a lot, but compared to the mainstay Luftwaffe propeller planes of the Second World War, the Bf-109 and the FW-190, of which over 50,000 total were produced, it's a drop in the bucket. Britain and the US also developed working jet engines and aircraft during the course of the war, however never deployed one in combat. It would not have combat-ready jet aircraft until years after. After the war, rocket planes, while largely used for experimental airplanes rather than production, still found their place in aviation. In 1947, the Bell X-1, a rocket-powered plane deployed from the bomb bay of a B-29, was the first recorded aircraft to break the sound barrier, piloted by Second World War ace and legendary aviator Chuck Yeager. Rocket planes continue to hold the speed record with the Bell X-1B, the Bell X-2, and finally the North American X-15 that flew first in 1960 and in 1967 set the speed record of 7,297 kilometers per hour or 4,534 miles per hour. That still stands to this day. Anyways, jet-powered aircraft pretty much entirely dominated the military and civil aviation scene since their emergence and adoption. On the civil side of things, jet engines replaced propeller planes for commercial flights, and as the decades passed, tickets got cheaper to the point where average schmucks like me could afford plane tickets across the globe, significantly shrinking the world for all. Also, just to be as thorough as possible, helicopters, that is, aircraft that use large spinning blades to generate lift, began to appear in the 1940s. They were not a notable factor in the Second World War. However, in the Korean War, their effect was more measurable, albeit still relatively small. The Vietnam War in the late 60s saw the extensive use of the helicopter for troop and cargo transport, including the famous Bell UH-1 Huey, the workhorse of the U.S. Army. Helicopters have also been used on the civil side of aviation, although often either for hobby, novelty, or private use, since commercial airlines are faster, can carry more people, and have a larger range. Anyways, back to airplanes. Bomber aircraft also continued development in the period following the Second World War, and in contrast to bombers during the war with many turrets, they focused instead on electronic countermeasures and jamming, as well as long ranges to deliver a potentially nuclear payload during the height of the Cold War. The massive B-52 Stratofortress bomber, put into service in 1955 and still flying to this day, has a range of over 8,000 miles, or 13,000 kilometers. And the British V-bombers such as the Avro Vulcan sacrificed range for ease of startup and flight. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention high-altitude spy planes developed for the Cold War, such as the Lockheed U-2 and SR-71 Blackbird, developed in the 50s and 60s respectively, the latter of which holds the speed record for the fastest air-breathing airplane and can outrun most missiles, but is unfortunately still not fast enough to outrun my existential dread. And finally, on the fighter airplane side, aircraft history nowadays is split up into generations based on when they were built and what their capabilities were. The first generation, the boomers, were born in... Oh wait, hang on, that's the wrong type of generation. The first generation of fighters, which were built in the 40s and early 50s, include fighters such as the Me-262 or the British Gloucester Meteor that were designed during the Second World War, and the MiG-15 and F-86 Sabre deployed in the Korean War. This first generation was primarily focused on developing the technology of jet engines and had little technology otherwise, still relying primarily on cannons for air-to-air capability. Second generation fighters prevailed in the 50s and early 60s and saw notable top speed increases in the beginnings of air-to-air missiles and radar. Third generation fighters in the mid-60s through 70s greatly improved on the missile capability, including beyond visual range engagements and multi-role support. Fighters like the F-4 Phantom, MiG-23, and Hawker's Siddeley Harrier were big during this era, and dogfighting drastically fell off. The fourth generation, which started in the 70s and has many aircraft that still fly in service today, such as the F-15, F-16, F-18, MiG-29, and Su-27, saw the return of the fighter-first mentality and reduction of multi-role capability, in addition to advanced digital avionics and radar, fly-by-wire systems allowing extreme maneuverability, and the introduction of stealth. For now, I'm going to skip 5th and 6th generation since it's a bit out of the scope of the history I'd like to explore on this channel, but maybe in the future we'll touch on them in a few videos. So, hopefully this video has helped you get a good sense for the history of aviation, and from here on in the future we'll be diving into the nitty-gritty details of lots of cool stuff throughout this period. Anyways, I'm out of time. I have to go study for my eye exam tomorrow, so I bid you farewell for now. If you enjoyed the video, I encourage you to subscribe so you can see new ones when I post them, and like I said in the intro, next week we'll be doing a brief history of rocketry and the space race. See you then!